Gavin Pearce was no stranger to careful budgeting. At 34, he prided himself on living efficiently in his small but cozy home in Silverwood Heights, a peaceful suburban neighborhood known for tree-lined streets and friendly block gatherings. A self-taught handyman, Gavin had always gone the extra mile to cut down on expenses wherever he could. He'd replaced incandescent bulbs with LED lights, installed faucet aerators to save water, and even insulated his attic with extra layers of eco-friendly material. Yet, over the past few months, something perplexing had begun to occur. His electricity bills were climbing steadily. At first, he attributed the rise to seasonal changes. Perhaps the air conditioning ran more than usual during the hotter weeks, or maybe his new computer setup consumed more power than expected. But as he dove into the details, analyzing each statement, he noticed that his usage numbers didn't match the total cost. It was as if there were invisible watts being pulled from his home, slipping through his fingers unnoticed. Gavin started testing every appliance in the house, methodically turning devices on and off to see which ones might be spiking his energy consumption. He scribbled down notes in a small spiral notebook, creating a table of expected costs versus what the billing receipts showed. On paper, his calculations suggested a modest energy footprint. In reality, the numbers were inexplicably higher. His evenings soon became a routine of detective work. Once he got home from his job at a local design firm, he'd log into the utility company's website to check daily usage charts. He'd stare at the rising bars on the screen, baffled. Why was his home drawing more power late at night when, by all accounts, he was either sleeping or away? At times, he wondered if the meter was malfunctioning. He considered calling the utility for an inspection but decided to gather more data on his own first. Gavin mentioned the situation in casual conversation with his neighbor, Mr. Delacroix, who shrugged sympathetically. "You might be overthinking," the older man suggested. "Sometimes rates just go up." Still, the explanation didn't sit right with Gavin. The increments on his bill seemed too erratic to be attributed solely to fluctuating costs. As the weeks passed, Gavin's curiosity sharpened into resolve. He couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something more was happening, something that lay beyond a simple rate change or a broken appliance. In the back of his mind, a wild thought floated: could someone be tapping into his power lines? It sounded far-fetched, the kind of scenario one read about in online forums or heard in a neighborly rumor, but he couldn't completely rule it out. Determined to uncover the truth, Gavin read up on methods for tracking electricity usage down to the device. He absorbed articles and watched tutorials until a clear plan emerged in his mind. His next step was to implement a more precise monitoring approach at home. If something, or someone, was siphoning power, he intended to catch it. This was his home, after all, and no unexplained spike on a bill would keep him from protecting what he'd worked so hard to maintain. In the wake of his growing suspicions, Gavin Pearce decided to take a proactive approach. He spent an entire weekend researching smart energy trackers, devices that provide real-time data on electricity consumption. After reading dozens of product reviews, he settled on a model hailed for its accuracy and user-friendly interface. Once the device arrived, Gavin wasted no time installing it in the breaker panel near his garage. Setting up the smart energy tracker took some patience. Gavin had to switch off the main power and carefully snap the monitoring clamps around the relevant circuits. While working, he discovered that these clamps could send data straight to an app on his phone, offering a minute-by-minute breakdown of his home's electricity usage. Satisfied with the initial test results, he flipped the power back on and watched the readings flicker to life on his screen. Next, he turned his attention to surveillance. Although he lived in a safe neighborhood, he wasn't taking any chances. He purchased a compact outdoor camera with night vision capability. Positioning it discreetly atop a corner of his porch, he angled the lens to capture both the driveway and the side yard where his external power sockets were located. If anyone was secretly tapping into his electricity, the camera would likely catch them in the act. With the tracker and camera in place, Gavin felt a mix of anticipation and nervousness. On one hand, he hoped to confirm that the rising bills were a simple error or a small oversight, maybe an appliance he'd overlooked was draining power. On the other, a quiet voice inside him insisted that he'd soon discover something more disturbing. In the days that followed, he developed a nightly routine. After dinner, Gavin would open the energy tracker app on his phone, scanning for unusual spikes. Then he'd check the camera feed to ensure everything looked normal outside. At first, it all seemed mundane. His usage curves were typical, reflecting the lights in the living room, the refrigerator's cycles, and occasional air conditioning. The camera showed nothing but faint images of passing cars and an occasional stray cat. Just as Gavin began to doubt his own suspicions, a sudden jolt in the energy tracker data appeared late one evening. He watched as his usage spiked significantly around 2 a.m. Curiously, he'd been in bed for hours with all major appliances turned off. Eager but apprehensive, Gavin opened the surveillance app to see if there was any corresponding footage. To his disappointment, the camera replay for that particular window was dark and uneventful, no movement or signs of anyone tampering with his outlets. Yet the data on his phone didn't lie, something had drawn a noticeable amount of power. Over the next couple of nights, the same pattern emerged, an inexplicable surge, followed by hours of normal levels. Determined to dig deeper, Gavin tweaked the camera's sensitivity settings and positioned an additional motion-activated light near the side of his house. If someone was sneaking onto his property, the light would catch them off guard, and the camera would record every detail. He even placed small reflective markers near his outdoor power sockets, hoping to make them more visible on the footage. By the end of that week, he felt like a vigilante in his own yard, patrolling for an invisible culprit. It was a strange feeling, living with the tension of expecting a trespasser yet seeing no clear evidence. Still, Gavin stayed resolute. He believed the truth would come to light, and he was prepared to protect his home from whatever, or whoever, was draining his electricity. Another week passed, and Gavin Pierce was more attuned than ever to the subtle details of his energy consumption. Each morning, he woke up and examined the overnight data from his smart energy tracker. Each evening, he scoured the camera feed for any signs of movement. For a while, he found nothing out of the ordinary, just a few random cats, the occasional raccoon scuttling around, and one or two neighbors walking their dogs later than usual. Then, on a Wednesday night around midnight, his phone buzzed with an alert from the surveillance camera's motion detector. Half asleep, Gavin tapped the notification and saw a live feed of a sleek, high-end electric coupe quietly pulling up to the curb by his driveway. The vehicle's headlights were off, and the driver was clearly trying to remain unnoticed. Gavin's eyes widened. He watched, transfixed, as the driver's door opened to reveal a woman he didn't recognize. She appeared to be in her mid-30s, well-dressed, with long, dark hair pulled into a neat ponytail. She glanced around furtively, then popped open the flap on his outdoor power socket. Within seconds, she plugged in a charging cable connected to her electric car. The entire act was executed with a practiced swiftness that suggested this wasn't her first time. His heart pounded, a mix of anger and shock flooding through him. So he wasn't imagining things, someone truly had been stealing his electricity. And not just anyone, but a woman with a pricey electric vehicle brazenly helping herself to his resources as though it were a public charging station. Unable to sleep, Gavin stayed up, phone in hand, watching this unauthorized charging session unfold in real time. The woman occasionally checked her watch, presumably waiting for enough of a charge to get where she was going. After about 40 minutes, she wrapped up her cable and drove off. The moment she was gone, Gavin opened the live feed of his energy tracker. There was the surge, plain as day, matching the exact window she'd been plugged into his outlet. The following day, he felt an urgent need to check for more evidence. Sure enough, replaying older camera footage revealed that this woman, who he would soon learn was named Julia Harrington, had been sneaking over several nights each week. Sometimes, she arrived around midnight, other times, closer to 3 in the morning. Always the same car, always the same routine of quietly tapping into his power supply. Gavin saved each clip, labeling them by date and time. A swirl of emotions plagued him, frustration that someone was violating his property, anger at her audacity, and a strange sense of betrayal that a neighbor, or someone living nearby, would do this without so much as asking permission. His rising electricity bills finally made sense. He found it ironic that a person who could afford a high-end electric coupe would stoop to stealing electricity from a modest homeowner. After collecting all the video evidence, Gavin resolved to confront her directly, politely but firmly. He wasn't eager for a fight, but he couldn't continue shouldering the cost of charging someone else's vehicle. That evening, he decided to wait outside around the time she usually appeared. If Julia showed up, he'd speak to her face-to-face and show her what he had recorded. Sure enough, just past 1 in the morning, the sound of a quiet engine rolling up to the curb reached Gavin's ears. From the shadow of his front porch, he watched as Julia exited her car and headed straight for the familiar outlet. Before she could plug in, Gavin stepped forward, flashlight in hand. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice steady despite his racing heartbeat, "but that's my private power socket." Julia froze, one hand gripping the cable. She glanced up, startled, then quickly tried to regain composure. My battery is really low," she stammered, forcing a polite smile. "I figured it wouldn't be a big deal if I borrowed a little charge." Gavin gestured to his porch camera. "I actually have footage of you doing this multiple times. I've been noticing spikes in my electric bill for weeks now, and I installed a system to confirm my suspicions." She frowned, an edge of defensiveness creeping into her tone. "Look, I'm not stealing. Electricity is everywhere, and I only needed a bit. Besides, if you can afford your bills, why make a fuss?" Appalled by her dismissive attitude, Gavin calmly explained how he'd collected timestamps, video clips, and data from the smart energy tracker. "I'm more than willing to share this with law enforcement if necessary," he warned, trying to remain civil. Julia's expression shifted. A hint of panic mingled with defiance as she glanced back at her car. "You're acting like I broke into your house or something. It's just power." The tension was palpable. Gavin stood his ground, ready to negotiate a solution, but also prepared to escalate if she refused to acknowledge her wrongdoing. Little did he know that her response would reveal an entirely different layer of entitlement and manipulation, one that would soon draw the attention of the local patrol unit and the rest of his neighbors. Standing in the glow of his porch light, Gavin Pierce took a steady breath as he confronted Julia Harrington. Her midnight visits to his driveway had finally been exposed, and now she faced him with a mixture of indignation and feigned innocence. The cable dangled from her hand, still inches away from the power socket she'd intended to exploit yet again. "Ma'am," Gavin began cautiously, "I have you on camera plugging your car into my outlet on multiple occasions. This isn't simply borrowing, it's unauthorized use of my electricity. Do you understand that it affects my bills?" Julia tossed her hair over her shoulder and let out a short laugh. "You make it sound like I'm some kind of criminal," she scoffed. "Electricity is cheap, anyway. What's a few kilowatt-hours here and there? I drive an eco-friendly car, for heaven's sake. Shouldn't you be happy I'm not spewing fumes?" Gavin's patience wavered. "That's beside the point. Driving an electric car is great, but charging it on someone else's dime is not. I installed a surveillance system exactly because I noticed inexplicable charges on my monthly statement." Rather than looking remorseful, Julia's expression hardened. "Look," she said bluntly, "my battery gets low sometimes when I'm out. It was convenient to plug in here for a quick top-up, no big deal. You never said anything before." "I had no idea who was doing it," Gavin pointed out, crossing his arms. "That's why I set up the camera and the monitor. Now that I know, I'm telling you directly, stop. Or at least arrange to pay for what you use." She paused, her eyes flickering to the small camera perched near the corner of Gavin's porch. It was clear she felt exposed, caught in the act without a plausible defense. Yet her pride refused to yield. She let out a dismissive snort. "Pay you? For electricity? Please. I wasn't exactly opening your wallet." A flicker of anger passed over Gavin's face, but he tried to keep his voice level. Electricity isn't free. If you had come to me months ago and asked to chip in for the cost, that might have been a different conversation. But sneaking in every night and plugging in your car, that's theft. Julia's cheeks flushed, her tone sharp. Don't label me a thief. You're acting like I broke some sacred law. I was just borrowing. And I'm sure if you do the math, it comes out to mere pocket change. Gavin reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, tapping a few buttons to bring up his energy tracker data. I have the exact figures. Over the past 6 weeks, I've seen spikes that amount to nearly $40 in extra charges, and that's just from the nights you've plugged in. It's not about the exact amount, it's the principle. You never asked. For a moment, Julia looked uncertain, as though she might apologize. But then her gaze shifted to a passing car on the street, and she seemed to straighten her posture defensively. You're making a spectacle of this, she accused. What if I told people you were harassing me? That I felt threatened by you cornering me like this at night? The insinuation struck a nerve. Gavin inhaled slowly, appalled by her readiness to flip the narrative. I'm not harassing you, he replied. I live here. And I'm the one who caught you trespassing. Julia's voice rose. Who's to say what this will look like if the police show up? A lone woman in a driveway, feeling intimidated by an angry homeowner. You might have your little videos, but who knows how that'll play out? Gavin shook his head, bristling at her manipulative tactic. He wanted to point out that the camera footage was crystal clear, no one could mistake her as a victim forced into plugging in her car. But part of him recognized the danger in her words. A single phone call could create a complicated situation, especially if she decided to misrepresent what had happened. Before he could respond, Julia yanked her charging cable back toward her car. I suggest you step away, she said, punching something on her phone's screen. You're making me uncomfortable, and I'm calling the local patrol to report that you're threatening me. Gavin stood there in stunned silence, the nighttime air thick with tension. If she truly intended to involve the authorities, he'd have to be prepared to show all the evidence he'd gathered. His biggest worry was how the officers might react to her performance of victimhood versus his calm explanation. Heart pounding, he cleared a path for her to leave, not wanting to escalate things further. Go ahead, he said quietly. But be aware, I have timestamps and video from every time you plugged in. I'll show them everything. Julia merely shot him a contemptuous glare as she got into her electric coupe and revved it up. Within moments, she was gone, leaving Gavin standing in the beam of his porch light, adrenaline coursing through his veins. It dawned on him that this was far from over. If she followed through on her threat, the patrol unit could be on his doorstep any minute, expecting to find a different scenario than the one that actually happened. Rather than panic, Gavin decided he'd wait calmly. He checked his phone again, verifying that each incriminating clip was safely stored. As uneasy as he felt about the possibility of being confronted by officers in the dead of night, he believed the truth was on his side. If Julia thought she could play the victim card to cover up her unauthorized charging, she would soon find herself facing the irrefutable reality captured on camera. The night air hung thick with tension after Julia Harrington drove away. Gavin Pierce stood on his porch, phone in hand, half expecting the local patrol officers to roll up any moment. Although Julia had left, the confrontation still reverberated in his mind. She had threatened to call the authorities and accuse him of harassment. In truth, he was the one who had discovered her stealing electricity, yet she was twisting the story in an attempt to paint him as the aggressor. For a few minutes, the street remained quiet. Gavin felt an odd sense of foreboding, wondering if Julia might return with the patrol unit in tow. His breathing gradually steadied, and he stepped inside, locking his front door but leaving the lights on. If the police did come knocking, he wanted to be prepared. He paced the living room, replaying every detail. He remembered how she scoffed at his accusations, her dismissive comments about borrowing power. But most troubling was her sudden shift to calling the patrol, using phrases like feeling threatened to frame the narrative. Gavin sighed, rubbing his temples. He wasn't naive, he knew all too well how accusations from one person could overshadow truth without proper evidence. He was relieved he had recordings, both from his smart energy tracker and the surveillance footage. Finally, about half an hour later, headlights cut across his windows. A dark-colored patrol car pulled up outside. Two officers stepped out, scanning the area with cautious curiosity. Gavin could see them from the living room window, so he opened the door and stepped onto the porch, hands visible and voice calm. "Good evening, officers," he said, nodding in greeting. "I'm guessing you're here because of a call from Ms. Julia Harrington." They exchanged glances. The older officer, whose name tag read Sergeant Butler, stepped forward. "We got a call from a woman who claimed she was harassed and felt unsafe," he stated. "She mentioned something about being confronted while she was on the sidewalk." Gavin exhaled steadily. "I'd like to clarify a few things. First, I have evidence that she was repeatedly charging her electric vehicle using my outdoor socket, which I never authorized. Second, I confronted her tonight after installing cameras to confirm who was responsible. I have video recordings if you'd like to see them." The second officer, a younger man named Officer Reyes, inclined his head. "You have footage of her on your property?" "Yes," Gavin replied. "She's been coming here at odd hours. It's all on camera, date-stamped and time-stamped. And my smart energy tracker logs the corresponding usage spikes." Sergeant Butler's gaze sharpened. "We'll need to view that footage. Ms. Harrington told us you threatened her." Gavin nodded, stepping inside to retrieve his tablet. "I can show you everything." He led them to his living room, where he pulled up the surveillance app. With a few taps, he brought up the clips from the previous nights, showing Julia pulling into his driveway, plugging her cable into the socket, and waiting while her car charged. The officers watched in silence. Each file told the same story: the sleek electric coupe rolling in after dark, the woman glancing around to avoid detection, then connecting to Gavin's power supply. There was no confrontation in those older clips, just the undeniable act of her siphoning electricity. Finally, he played the night's most recent clip, which caught the tail end of their argument. The audio was somewhat muffled, but it captured Julia's voice rising in indignation, followed by Gavin calmly stating that he had proof of her actions. The footage ended shortly after she threatened to call the patrol, painting a scene entirely at odds with her claim that he was harassing her. Officer Reyes broke the silence first. "It doesn't look like you threatened her," he remarked. "If anything, she's the one who escalated the situation." Sergeant Butler nodded in agreement. "This footage is quite clear. She's plugging her vehicle into your outlet without permission. That's an unauthorized use of your resources." Relief washed over Gavin's face. "I appreciate you taking the time to watch. I've been careful to document everything precisely because I suspected she'd try to turn the tables." Officer Reyes jotted down a few notes. "Ms. Harrington claimed you cornered her, but the video shows she was on your property. This changes the context significantly." Sergeant Butler cleared his throat. "Since she made the call, we'll have to write up a report. But from what we see here, it appears you've been the victim of theft, electrical theft, to be exact. Do you have any interest in pressing charges?" Gavin hesitated. He had thought about it briefly. Part of him wanted to hold Julia accountable for repeatedly driving up his bills. Yet he wasn't eager to entangle himself in a drawn-out legal process if it could be avoided. "I'd like to speak to her directly about covering the costs," he said. "But if she refuses to cooperate, pressing charges might be the only option." Sergeant Butler nodded. "Understood. If Ms. Harrington returns or if there's any further harassment on her end, don't hesitate to contact us. We have a record of what you've shown us here." After giving Gavin a case number and a phone number for follow-up, the officers stepped out. Standing at his door, Gavin watched them drive away, a swirl of emotions coursing through him. He felt vindicated that his evidence had convinced the patrol of his side of the story, yet he also wondered how Julia would react once she realized her attempt to cast herself as the victim had failed. As he closed and locked the door, Gavin resolved to remain vigilant. The next steps were unclear. Would Julia apologize and offer to pay him back? Or would she escalate her efforts to avoid responsibility? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going to let her continue stealing his electricity without consequence. Even with the late hour, Gavin Pierce's phone buzzed incessantly after the patrol car left. Friends and a couple of neighbors had apparently noticed the flashing lights through their windows, and a few texts trickled in asking if he was all right. He responded briefly that there had been a misunderstanding with someone, but it was now under control. He wasn't ready to broadcast the entire fiasco to the neighborhood just yet. He woke the next morning with a knot in his stomach, wondering if Julia Harrington might stage another confrontation or file a follow-up complaint. Just before noon, his anxious speculation became reality. She turned up, marching up his driveway as if she owned the place. The glare on her face told him this wouldn't be a friendly visit. "I spoke to the officers after they left here," she announced, arms crossed. "And I want you to know they treated me like a criminal because of your accusations." Gavin stepped onto his porch, resisting the urge to roll his eyes. "No one treated you like a criminal. The footage shows you using my outlet without my permission. They saw the same videos I have." Julia scoffed. "A few minutes of video and some arbitrary data from a gadget on your power line. That doesn't prove anything except that I was parked near your house." He raised an eyebrow. "Come on, Julia. You plugged your charging cable into my outdoor socket." The camera recorded the exact moment the cable was connected. "The data from my smart energy tracker lines up perfectly with your visits." Her jaw tightened, but she forged ahead. "You made me look bad. Now the entire neighborhood is whispering about me. Do you realize that I have a reputation to protect? My job involves building relationships, and rumors like these can ruin everything." Gavin shook his head, trying to remain composed. "I didn't create the rumor. I only recorded what you were doing. All I want is for you to acknowledge it and compensate me for the electricity you took." She ignored his request for reimbursement and switched tactics. "You know, it's interesting that you mention me stealing your power. I remember overhearing you once saying you're short on money. Maybe this is your way of trying to extort cash from me, making a big deal out of a few kilowatt-hours." Outrage flared within Gavin. "This has never been about the money, Julia. It's about respecting boundaries. If you'd asked politely to pay for charging once or twice, I might have agreed. But you sneaked around at night, more than once, hoping I wouldn't find out." Her posture became defensive. "I never sneaked," she snapped. "I just assumed an unused outlet wouldn't matter. You could have confronted me the first time. But you waited, probably to gather evidence and dramatize it." Gavin let out a slow breath, reminding himself to stay calm. "The fact remains, you only agreed to talk now because you were caught. You even called the patrol, claiming you felt threatened, as if I was the villain here." She threw her hands up. "I did feel threatened. It's dark, I'm alone, and you come out of nowhere, shining a light in my face." He recalled that moment clearly. He'd been standing on his own porch, shining a small flashlight at the ground to avoid startling her. Still, he knew how the scene could be twisted. "Julia, you were on my property. I have every right to check why someone is plugging into my power at 1 a.m. For a moment, silence fell between them. Cars passed by on the street, and the wind rustled through a neighbor's oak tree. Julia glanced around, possibly aware of how they looked to anyone watching. Her earlier bravado wavered. "What are you expecting from me?" she finally asked, her voice tinged with both resentment and uncertainty. Gavin took a measured step forward, but still maintained a polite distance. "First, an admission that what you did was wrong. And second, I want reimbursement for the electricity you used. It's not a huge sum, but it's the principle. After that, we can both move on." She narrowed her eyes. And if I refuse? He shrugged calmly. Then I consider taking legal steps. The officers have the case on file, and they've seen the evidence. I don't want to escalate, but I won't let you keep trampling on my property rights. Julia clutched her purse, looking torn. You're really not going to let this go, are you? I'm not, Gavin said softly, because I shouldn't have to. A tense pause followed, then she exhaled sharply. Fine. I'll think about what compensation makes sense. But don't expect me to grovel. And don't think this means I admit to theft. I still believe you're making a mountain out of a molehill. With that, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Gavin on the porch. Although no promises had been made, he felt a faint stirring of relief. At least she seemed to realize the seriousness of the situation now. He wondered whether she'd come to her senses and settle the matter peacefully or continue painting herself as the aggrieved party. Either way, Gavin was resolute. The evidence he had gathered would protect him, and he was confident the truth would hold up if she pulled any more stunts. The neighborhood might gossip and speculate, but one fact remained unshakable: Julia had been caught red-handed, and no amount of feigned victimhood could erase the footage that proved it. A few days later, Gavin Pierce was sorting through some older camera files, making sure he had everything archived in one place, when he stumbled upon something even more disturbing than the theft itself. As he replayed a clip from 2 weeks back, one he'd initially skimmed without audio, he realized Julia Harrington had muttered comments under her breath that he hadn't caught before. When he turned the volume up, her words became chillingly clear. While hooking up her charging cable that night, Julia had glanced around, hissing complaints about Gavin. Most of her muttering was about how inconsiderate he was for not offering free electricity. But then, in a lowered tone, she had lobbed thinly veiled insults tinged with racial and cultural bias, implying that he was probably one of those cheapskates and these people never know how to share. Though not overtly explicit, the undertones were undeniably discriminatory. Gavin sat there, stunned. He'd initially been outraged that she was stealing from him. Now, he realized her entitlement ran deeper, fueled by a prejudice that painted him as inferior or somehow undeserving of basic respect. Anger smoldered in his chest, but beneath it lay a profound disappointment. In Silverwood Heights, a neighborhood he believed was progressive and inclusive, here was a neighbor displaying age-old biases dressed up as casual remarks. He contacted the local patrol station to inform them he'd found additional footage relevant to his case. Sergeant Butler, the officer who had previously reviewed the recordings, agreed to come by in person. Within a few hours, Butler arrived, accompanied by Officer Reyes. Gavin led them to his laptop, where he queued up the newly discovered clip. The two officers listened intently, their expressions darkening at the audible remarks. While the law in their region didn't always prosecute derogatory language on its own, the statements could contribute to the overall context of Julia's behavior. Officer Reyes made notes, while Sergeant Butler shook his head in dismay. "This adds another layer," Butler remarked, removing his cap and running a hand through his hair. "Not only did she take your electricity, she apparently holds some discriminatory views." Gavin, arms crossed, took a breath. "I'm not surprised that prejudice still exists, but it's jarring to see it so personally targeted. I hate that it's part of this entire mess." The officers thanked Gavin for sharing the file, stating they would add it to the ongoing report. Although it wasn't guaranteed that such remarks would lead to additional charges, the footage would provide essential context if Julia tried to twist the story further. It also underscored her mindset, someone who felt entitled to steal and then demean the person she was exploiting. Word of these developments began to circulate among the local residents. A few neighbors, upon learning that Julia had resorted to bigoted language, rallied around Gavin. Mrs. Ramirez from across the street dropped by with homemade cookies as a gesture of support, lamenting how she never suspected such behavior from Julia. Others muttered that the neighborhood's welcoming vibe was tarnished by one person's prejudice. In the days that followed, a subtle shift occurred. Those who had initially stayed out of the feud, perhaps not wanting to take sides, started leaning toward Gavin's account. They recognized that he wasn't just complaining about electricity bills, he was dealing with a neighbor who had crossed ethical and moral boundaries. People began approaching Gavin to say they'd seen Julia's car near his property at odd hours, corroborating his timeline. A few apologized for not believing him sooner. Meanwhile, Julia's interactions with the neighborhood grew strained. Some residents confronted her about the allegations of racist comments, while others simply avoided her altogether. She maintained her stance that Gavin was overreacting, but her words carried less weight each day. The quiet condemnation from her fellow neighbors seemed to rattle her, and she became increasingly defensive in public encounters, sometimes snapping at people who offered even the mildest criticism. Gavin took no pleasure in her mounting social isolation. He wasn't out to ruin her life, he only wanted restitution and an acknowledgement of her wrongdoing. Yet the more he heard about her lashing out, the more he worried she might be spiraling into anger rather than facing reality. If she refused to accept responsibility, a legal confrontation might be unavoidable. In a final twist, Sergeant Butler called Gavin one afternoon to say that Julia had reached out to the station. She wanted to discuss the possibility of resolving matters amicably. Curious but cautious, Gavin agreed to meet at the precinct. He arrived to find Julia and her lawyer waiting in a conference room, along with Officer Reyes. Her lawyer spoke first, explaining that Julia wished to settle any claims of stolen electricity without going to court. He mentioned the possibility of a written agreement where she'd reimburse Gavin for the estimated costs, plus a bit extra for any inconvenience. Gavin listened, arms folded, as Julia sat silently, gaze lowered. He leaned forward, placing a printed summary of the kilowatt-hours used on the table. "I'm open to that," he said evenly, "but only if we address the hateful remarks she made. There needs to be an acknowledgement that her behavior was unacceptable, both the unauthorized charging and the discriminatory comments." Julia's cheeks reddened. She muttered something under her breath. The lawyer pressed his lips together, clearly aware this was non-negotiable. "We can prepare a statement indicating Ms. Harrington regrets any misunderstanding or offense caused," he offered diplomatically. Gavin's eyes flickered to Julia's face. Her expression was stony, but she nodded almost imperceptibly. It wasn't exactly a heartfelt apology, yet it was a step toward closure. They ironed out the numbers, an amount that would cover the stolen power and a modest gesture for the trouble. The lawyer typed up a draft document, and both parties reviewed it under the watchful eye of Officer Reyes. As he added his signature, Gavin felt a weight lift, though it wasn't the triumphant satisfaction one might expect. He simply felt relieved that the situation would no longer hang over his day-to-day life. Whether Julia truly changed her mindset was another matter entirely, but at least her theft and offensive remarks wouldn't continue unchecked. Once the settlement with Julia Harrington was drafted, Gavin Pierce expected the tension to gradually fade. However, news travels quickly in Silverwood Heights, and neighbors who had been following the drama wanted updates. Some approached Gavin directly to ask how he was doing, while others merely whispered among themselves at the local coffee shop or on social media groups. One evening, as Gavin worked on a small landscaping project in his front yard, a handful of neighbors wandered over. Among them was Mrs. Ramirez, who had shown him kindness earlier with her cookie delivery. There was also Mr. Delacroix, the older gentleman who'd previously dismissed Gavin's concerns about high electricity bills. He now admitted he regretted not taking Gavin seriously. "Is it true?" asked Mrs. Ramirez, concern evident on her face. "That she was stealing your electricity and making nasty remarks about you?" "I heard some rumors, but I want to hear it straight from you." Gavin nodded, pausing with his shovel. He explained, in broad strokes, that Julia had indeed been using his power socket without permission and that he had video evidence to prove it. He also acknowledged the recordings of her discriminatory remarks, which had proven to be a tipping point for many. "I'm not trying to smear her," he clarified. "But people deserve to know why I took the steps I did." As more neighbors trickled over, the conversation became a mini town hall. Some were horrified. Others nodded sagely, mentioning their own suspicions about Julia's conduct. One person mentioned hearing her complain about certain types of people moving into the neighborhood. Another recalled noticing her car parked oddly late at night near various homes, though they hadn't connected the dots until now. "I just don't get it," said a woman named Felicia, who lived 2 doors down from Gavin. "Why would someone with a high-end electric coupe need to mooch off another resident's electricity? She can't be strapped for cash if she bought a car like that." Gavin shrugged. "Entitlement, maybe. She might think my outlet is fair game. Or she believes she can do what she wants without consequences." Mr. Delacroix sighed heavily. "I feel partially responsible. When Gavin first mentioned his bills skyrocketing, I brushed him off. If I'd just paid closer attention, maybe Julia wouldn't have gotten away with it for so long." Gavin gave a small smile of reassurance. "It's not your fault. I didn't even know who it was until I set up the camera. But I do appreciate everyone supporting me now." Just then, a figure appeared across the street, Julia herself. She stood on her front lawn, arms folded tightly, observing the small crowd gathered around Gavin. Even from a distance, the tension was palpable. She seemed to realize that the neighborhood sentiment had largely turned against her. Words of condemnation muttered among neighbors carried on the evening breeze, and she pursed her lips, retreating indoors rather than facing them. "This whole thing is so unfortunate," said Mrs. Ramirez, shaking her head. "I hate to see conflict in our community, but she brought it on herself." Others nodded. A few voiced how they'd once welcomed Julia when she moved to Silverwood Heights, attending block parties and giving her recommendations for local services. They never expected her to show such blatant disregard for a neighbor's property and stoop to biased language. Gavin found the sense of collective support heartening but also slightly overwhelming. He had never aspired to be at the center of the neighborhood's attention, much less for a dispute like this. Yet he couldn't deny feeling validated. For weeks, he'd questioned himself. Was he imagining things? Was it worth the trouble? Would anyone believe him? Now, he saw that many were willing to stand up for him once the evidence spoke for itself. "Thank you all," he said at length, leaning on his shovel. "I'm hoping we can put this behind us soon. I've reached a settlement with her to reimburse me for the electricity and, hopefully, that puts an end to it." Felicia gave him a warm smile. "You handled it with more grace than a lot of people would have. Some folks would have pressed charges immediately." It was a sentiment echoed by several of them. Gavin, though he appreciated their praise, couldn't help a lingering worry that Julia might still lash out in some way. After all, the legal settlement didn't guarantee a change of heart on her part. It simply forced her to pay what she owed and acknowledge some wrongdoing. Human nature being what it was, he feared resentment might brew beneath the surface. Still, the sense of communal solidarity buoyed him. As the gathering disbanded and neighbors went back to their houses, Gavin felt a renewed sense of belonging. Silverwood Heights wasn't perfect, Julia's behavior made that painfully clear, but at least he knew there were people around him who cared about integrity and fairness. Later that night, as he tidied up his landscaping tools, he saw lights flick on in Julia's front window. It crossed his mind to wonder how she felt now that the community had turned its gaze on her. If she'd harbored illusions of painting herself as the victim, the additional footage revealing her biased comments had undercut that narrative. Whether she would eventually apologize or remain defiant was anyone's guess. Gavin sighed, reminding himself that he'd done all he could. The new cameras and the smart energy tracker remained in place, a continuing deterrent should Julia, or anyone else, ever get the idea to siphon power again. He could only hope that with the neighborhood aware and supportive, the matter would finally rest, allowing everyone to move forward in a more transparent, respectful environment. Despite the public fallout and the pointed discussions around Julia Harrington's actions, Gavin Pierce decided against escalating the situation any further. His primary desire was to recover the funds for the electricity she had taken, nothing more, nothing less. If she complied with their settlement agreement, he had no intention of dragging her through the courts or demanding additional compensation. A week passed without incident. Gavin's surveillance recordings showed that no one had attempted to use his outlet. The smart energy tracker, too, reported consistent numbers that aligned perfectly with his legitimate household usage. It seemed that, for the time being, Julia had ceased her late-night visits. Meanwhile, a few neighbors quietly expressed surprise at Gavin's decision not to file a formal complaint. Some believed that pressing charges might deter any future acts of property tampering, not just from Julia but from anyone else who might get a similar idea. But Gavin held firm to his philosophy. He didn't want to turn a neighborhood dispute into a legal circus if he could help it. He mentioned to close friends how his motives went beyond personal convenience. Part of him wanted to show that conflict could be resolved without making everything about retribution. Julia's behavior had been unethical and inexcusable, yet he believed she could still learn from the experience if she recognized the seriousness of her actions. That said, Gavin wasn't naive. He'd already armed himself with evidence if she ever tried something similar again. The settlement agreement included a clause that allowed him to revisit legal options if the theft resumed or if any other form of harassment occurred. Thus, even though he chose a path of leniency, he maintained the means to protect himself, should her behavior escalate. A quiet relief settled over his home. The doorbell no longer rang with unexpected nighttime visitors. His power bills quickly dropped to the levels he'd expected all along, providing an everyday reminder of how much he'd been losing before. Neighbors gradually stopped talking about the stolen electricity scandal, although the memory lingered. The moral of the tale stuck with them. Even a seemingly harmless act of borrowing can spiral into something far more serious, especially when laced with prejudice and deceit. For Gavin, life returned to its usual pace, fixing things around the house, working on design projects, and nurturing the friendships he'd built in Silverwood Heights. Late one afternoon, as he relaxed on his front porch with a cup of iced tea, he felt a weight lifted from his shoulders. The ordeal had tested his patience and sense of fairness, but it had also shown him the strength of his convictions. He hoped Julia had taken something valuable from this, too, an understanding that respect for others' property and dignity wasn't optional. Only time would reveal whether she'd truly changed. Until then, Gavin remained resolute in his choice. He'd won back his peace of mind without stooping to vengeance, and that, he decided, was victory enough. In the days leading up to her final settlement payment, Julia Harrington made few appearances in the neighborhood. When she did emerge, she kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with the locals who had once been more than willing to greet her. The tension that once simmered on street corners had dissolved, replaced by a quiet acknowledgement that she had faced consequences for her actions. One early morning, Gavin Pierce opened his mailbox to find an envelope marked with Julia's name. Inside was a check covering the remaining balance they had agreed upon. There was no accompanying note, no apology, no message of reconciliation, just the bare minimum that fulfilled her part of the settlement. Gavin stared at the check for a moment, feeling a pang of regret that it had all come to this. Nonetheless, he deposited it promptly, relieved that the situation was one step closer to closure. Word spread quickly around Silverwood Heights that Julia had settled her debt. A handful of neighbors approached Gavin over the next few days to commend him on how he had handled everything. Some praised his calm demeanor and refusal to escalate, others said they admired his willingness to forgive the offense without pressing charges. His composure, they insisted, had helped the community see the truth more clearly. During a brief run-in with Mrs. Ramirez at the local grocery store, Gavin found himself smiling at her enthusiastic praise. Not many people would have stayed so level-headed, she told him, packing apples into a paper bag. We're proud to have a neighbor like you, someone who doesn't let injustice slide but also doesn't let anger take over. Gavin thanked her, a bit bashful at the spotlight. He was grateful the neighborhood recognized his intentions. He hadn't sought to embarrass Julia, only to protect his rights and be reimbursed for what she had taken. That she ended up humiliated was a byproduct of her own choices, not any malicious desire on his part. In the weeks that followed, a subtle shift took hold. People in Silverwood Heights became more open about discussing boundaries and community etiquette. Some neighbors installed more outdoor lighting or security features, spurred by Gavin's example. Block parties continued as usual, but with a renewed sense of unity. If disputes arose, residents seemed more inclined to address them openly rather than let them fester in secrecy. As for Julia, she appeared increasingly withdrawn. On rare occasions, Gavin glimpsed her high-end electric coupe pulling in or out of her garage. She never lingered in the driveway or engaged in friendly small talk. Perhaps time would soften her resentments, but for now, the gulf between her and the rest of the neighborhood remained. Gavin, sitting on his porch one evening with a gentle breeze ruffling his hair, reflected on how swiftly life could change when one person's poor judgment collided with another's sense of justice. He'd been pulled into a conflict he never asked for, yet emerged with his integrity intact. The stolen electricity was a minor loss in the grand scheme of things. The triumph lay in standing up for himself without losing sight of his own values.